Hey there guys, today we're taking a look at the Beelink SER5 running with a Ryzen 5 5560U. Now this little mini PC came with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and this 6-core 12-thread CPU is paired with a Radeon 6 GPU, which means it has 6 Vega architecture cores on it. Now this mini PC has recently been going on sale pretty frequently for around $300 US, and there's been a few times that it's actually even been below that. We're going to be taking a look at 9 different games running on this mini PC and see what the performance level is actually like. Now the first game we're taking a look at running on this mini PC is World War Z Aftermath. Now this team-based survival zombie shooter is currently running with the built-in benchmark in Vulkan mode at the lowest in-game graphics settings with FSR set to performance mode. Now the system itself actually has 2 TDP modes. If you have the power plan set to the balanced preset, it defaults to a 15-watt TDP, but if you set it to the high performance power preset, then you get all the way up to 25 watts, and I recommend you just go with the full 25 watts at all times. No reason at all to switch between the two. The 25 watts actually runs perfectly cool and quiet on this system, that there's no reason at all to not use it at all times unless you have very specific workloads. Now, while the results with the built-in benchmark look really nice, if we actually jump into the game with those exact settings, you can see here that the numbers that we were being shown aren't exactly representative of the final product. While actually in game playing around in a specific level, this is of course the Rome level, just doing a full run on this ended up giving us an FPS average of 57 and 1% lows of 36. So while still more than playable, it is slightly below the numbers that we were getting with the built-in benchmark. But I would say that in both situations, the game is more than playable. That being said, if 1% lows of 36 bother you, you can drop the base resolution down to 900p. And doing that with the built-in benchmark, you can see is already giving us very noticeable increases in both our 1% lows and our averages. That being said, we also have established that the built-in benchmark isn't 100% representative of the actual gaming experience. Really, what it's mostly good for is just making comparisons, since we at least do get consistent scenes, even if the level of performance that it gives us isn't exactly representative of the actual gaming experience. We can at least see how different pieces of hardware or the same hardware will run at just different settings. And with the final FPS average of 72 and 1% lows of 54, we pretty much see an uplift on both ends, though not a substantial one. Then of course, jumping into actual gameplay with the exact same mission as before, we end up with a less noticeable improvement in performance, though overall still a welcome one. With an FPS average of 65 and 1% lows of 42, we're still not able to get our 1% lows above 60, but overall the experience is still very smooth and you'll have really not much to complain about. Though the fact that you could pretty much play this at the native 1080p resolution with FSR on top of it, it pretty much means that you're going to get the absolute best experience with that. Using a lower resolution, I don't think is too worth it for a game that isn't really ultra competitive. But moving on to the next game, we have Batman Arkham Knight. Now here we have the built-in benchmark running at the full 1080p resolution with the lowest in-game graphics settings. And overall, the FPS average and 1% lows that we end up getting here pretty much lets us know that we're going to get a rock solid 30 FPS gaming experience, but that's about it. With the final FPS average of 34 and 1% lows of 27, it's certainly not the most ideal gaming experience, but by the end of all of this, it does at least let us know that if we wanted to play at the full 1080p resolution and we were okay with 30 FPS, we could definitely do it. Really, if we want the closest thing to a 60 FPS gaming experience, we have to drop all the way down to 720p, and this is not a catch-all save. With a final average of 49 FPS with 1% lows of 37, it isn't exactly the most ideal gaming situation, but it is at least very smooth, and it is an overall improvement gameplay-wise compared to just the full 1080p resolution. Of course, if we jump into the actual gameplay and roam around the city, you'll see that the 1% lows are really the biggest thing that take a hit here. But still, after around 30 minutes of gameplay, just running around the city, gliding around, and just dealing with bad guys on the street, we end up with an FPS average of 47 and 1% lows of 31. So overall, still a playable experience, though it's not going to be the most ideal. I think that the vast majority of people will be more than comfortable playing like this if you really want to get through the game. Now, next up on the list, we have Doom 2016, and you see it currently running right now at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and this is with the Vulkan API. Now, the level of performance performance that we're getting here isn't exactly spectacular, but it is at least decent enough. With an FPS average of 41 and 1% lows of 31, considering that we are running this at the full 1080p resolution, not even using any upscaler with it, it's impressive enough performance. Though with a game like Doom, you would pretty much want as high a performance as you could possibly get, and this is just slightly below being the most ideal situation. Still, it was very playable, and I really couldn't complain too much while just going through this mission here. And in general, I feel like if you really wanted to finish this game, you could definitely play it like this. It's just not going to be the most ideal situation. Of course, we can drop the resolution down, and by dropping all the way down to 720p, you'll see that we have a completely different world of performance here, with our 1% lows being more than high enough and really seeing the biggest improvement and giving us a far smoother experience. With a final average of 75 FPS and 1% lows of 52, we're in a completely different world in terms of overall gaming experience, and this felt really nice to play. And the lower resolution really wasn't that much of a bother, considering that a lot of the combat in the game is just very up close and personal anyway, so the lower resolution wasn't as much of a hindrance, and the increased smoothness made the overall experience of playing the game feel significantly better. Now, after trying out Doom, I decided to pick up another shooter and see if we could get some pretty decent performance out of this. We're taking a look at Killing Floor 2. Now, the game is currently running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, and overall the level of performance that we're getting here is pretty decent, especially considering that I was just sitting back using a controller while playing. The lower levels of performance that we are getting here in comparison to, say, a full-fledged gaming PC aren't exactly the worst, and really I could comfortably continue to play the game like this if this was the only way I could actually play this. And after a full run, getting an FPS average of 56 with 1% lows of 36 pretty much means that this is a more than decent enough experience for the vast majority of people to really enjoy this. Of course, if you're someone that's trying to maximize your FPS, you can try to lower the resolution, but overall I would say that at the full 1080p resolution you're going to be able to play this perfectly fine without too much issues, though the 1% lows might drag you down in situations with really intense combat. And in those situations you might prefer to run the game at the 900p resolution, because the overall experience that we get at this lower resolution is just better 1% lows and significantly better averages, in the sense that things do feel a lot smoother. With a final average of 73 and 1% lows of 51, it pretty much means we're getting a ultra smooth experience and will never really dip below 60. And all of this by just sacrificing a little bit of resolution. Personally, playing on the built-in display of a laptop, this wouldn't really be too much of a problem, but of course, since this is a mini PC, it is hooked up to a 24-inch 144Hz display at 1080p. And while visually it didn't look amazing, the overall gameplay was just so much better that it really didn't bother me too much. And so as long as you're not ultra sensitive to resolution, this is a really ideal way to play the game. After having some notable success with the last two shooters, I decided to also check out Payday 2. Now, Payday 2 running at the full 1080p resolution with the lowest in-game graphics settings isn't exactly performing as well as the other games were. With a final FPS average of 44 and 1% lows of 31, it's not exactly the greatest experience to try to play like this, though it's not the worst either, especially since I was still continuing to play with a controller. It really wasn't bothering me as much, but I can completely understand that if I was playing with a mouse, this would probably be more of a bother to me. But this does show that this little mini PC can actually handle being somewhat of like a mini console, where I was just able to boot up these games, sit back, relax, and play through them as I was doing these benchmark numbers. Of course, if we drop the resolution all the way down to 720p, we do get a noticeable improvement in the overall performance, where now our FPS average ends up being at a 67 FPS and our 1% lows end up at 42. So we do get a significantly smoother overall gaming experience. And it's really hard to complain too much about it, especially since it's a lot of the times just hordes of enemies coming at you. But there are situations within this game where you are shooting at enemies that are pretty much sniping at you, and it can be a little difficult to see them at a distance with such a low resolution. But in most of the engagements that you'll be in this game, it really won't be a problem. And the level of performance that we're getting out of this is just nice. Now, continuing on with the list of gaming successes here, we have Monster Hunter Rise. Now, originally this game is a Switch game, which means that it in general was just designed around the idea of being far more basic and simple than Monster Hunter World. And because of that, I've actually found this game to run really well on low-end systems. Currently at the full 1080p resolution with the lowest in-game graphics settings, you can see that we're getting an FPS average of 45 with 1% lows of 39. So while we're not getting a 60 FPS average, the fact that the 1% lows and the averages are so close together pretty much means that we're getting a really rock solid and consistent experience, which means that even though we're not getting a 60 FPS average, it at least feels very smooth for us to play. And this is more than acceptable for the vast majority of people to try to play. Of course, if you're someone obsessed with trying to get a above 60 FPS average, you can try to lower the in-game resolution. Now, if we set the render target resolution within the game to just 70%, which is what it wants to do at the lowest in-game preset, you'll see that the averages and 1% lows see a pretty hefty improvement for just a drop of 30% in resolution. With a final FPS average of 93 and 1% lows of 71, it pretty much means that we're having a rock solid gaming experience throughout all of this. And we can even utilize a high refresh rate display, which I was using, and it did make the overall gaming experience far better. Pretty overall happy with the result here. After that series of pretty nice wins for the mini PC, we can move on to some things that absolutely bring it to its knees. We have Red Dead Redemption 2 running right now with the built-in benchmark at the lowest in-game graphics settings with FSR set to the performance preset. So this is the most ideal possible situation for it at the full 1080p resolution, and unfortunately the level of performance that we get falls apart. With 1% lows that are at least very close to our average, a consistent FPS of 22 isn't exactly going to be an amazing experience, and for a game as cinematic as this, I really would just recommend waiting until you have a better system so you can play it at a much higher resolution with an FPS that isn't even too low to be considered a movie. Of course, dropping the base resolution all the way to 720p and using FSR on top of that does net us an FPS increase where our 1% lows are now closer to and pretty much always keeps at 30 FPS with averages of 36. So if you don't mind playing the game at what is effectively half of the resolution of 720p, you can get somewhat of a playable experience out of this. You're just at such a low resolution that I hope you ripped out the screen of an old DS to try to play this, because outside of that, the visual experience is just so bad that I don't really think that most people are going to find this game to be enjoyable to play like this. Just take a look at the ground. And continuing on with the list of games that it can't play, we have The Witcher 3 here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and as you can see, the level of performance that we're getting is pretty abysmal. With 1% lows of 21 and an average of 28, it isn't exactly the most ideal gaming situation, especially because there are scenarios and areas that are just going to be more graphically intensive. So if we're barely at the edge of playability here, in those moments, things are just going to completely fall apart. Of course, 720p is a major improvement overall here, with an FPS average that ended up being 54 and 1% lows of 42. It pretty much means that now we're at a range where this is a very playable experience. A pretty much night and day difference over where we were at the full 1080p resolution. Our frame times in general just look really nice here, and it lets us know that we're going to have a very smooth and consistent gaming experience. And that's really what you want out of this. So while 1080p was disappointing, this actually does end up being a win at 720p. And finishing off this video, we have Rainbow Six Siege running with the built-in benchmark on the Vulkan API with the lowest in-game graphics settings, which of course does use temporal upscaling to set the base resolution to half of 1080p and upscales that. And using this, we get an FPS average of 54 with a 1% low of 47. So a playable experience, though nothing amazing. That being said, though, the game was actually recently updated to support FSR, and you can actually use FSR and the temporal upscaling mixed together. And doing that with FSR set to the performance mode and still that 50% resolution of 1080p, we actually get get some really nice results here. With 1% lows of 62 and an average of 72, it pretty much means that we're getting now a really nice experience that is above 60 FPS, and in a lot of scenes it looks pretty much identical. You can definitely see a reduction in overall quality, but it wasn't to the extent where visually speaking it becomes unusable. This actually impressed me a lot, where we were able to get a nice bump in performance without really sacrificing too much of the visuals. So after running all those games, what is the overall result that I got out of this? Well, with the exception of Red Dead Redemption 2, pretty much all of the games were at least able to be played at a reasonable level with this specific system, whether that meant dropping the resolution all the way down to 720p or relying on features like FSR. Really, Red Dead Redemption 2 was the only one where you would have to use such aggressive FSR settings that it just does not make sense to really use on a system like this. That being said, this small and compact system can actually give some really nice levels of performance in older AAA titles or esports titles, and if you're someone that mostly plays indie games and things like that, then this thing is an actual dream to have. Really, with the level of performance that it gave in a game like Killing Floor 2, you could invite a friend over and actually have them use this as a LAN machine, and they'll have a reasonable enough time. And I think that at the price point that they're selling this little machine at, it actually makes a lot of sense. So if you're interested in picking up this system, you can check out the link down below and see what the pricing is like for you right now. It's certainly a very cool and quiet system, and with the level of performance that you can get out of this, you can actually work through your backlog of games. But anyways, I'll catch you guys in the next one.